All my life, I've always tried to do something that would, in some way, answer internal yearnings that were not clear to me. So I went through various stages in my life, from pre-medical school to acting. I left school to become an actor, which was a major change for me. I was very close to what I wanted to do. And after a while, it did not answer that inner yearning. And I said, I have always wanted to be a therapist, to deal with people's inner workings. As an actor, I thought I was doing that, but ultimately they all became my inner workings, no matter who I played. So I took a leave of absence from acting and became MSW, a social worker. And I did therapy for about 9-10 years until the audiobook world began to loom on the horizon. And interesting enough, as I was a therapist, there's a book called I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb, which is a tremendously well-crafted saga of a man's life. And in it, there's a part of a psychiatrist who deals with this character's brother who is a psychopath. And I used that therapist's methods on patients that I was seeing. So the fusion of art, of therapy, of acting, of pretending you're someone else was incredible, because I helped this person, having done an audiobook and playing the part of a psychiatrist. So it was furthering of the yearning for whatever internal questions I have yet to fill out. And the audiobook then became such a phenomenon that I could no longer practice therapy, and I went full-time into the audiobook world, which answers a lot of that I always wanted to question, because it gives me a wonderful entrance into literature of all kinds, in which there are all kinds of people to deal with, but they come through me. So that process, when I do a portrait of a character, which in my business is a vocal portrait, but you can't deny the internal workings of the person who is making that vocal portrait, that seems to have given me what I was yearning for, the process of doing an audiobook and creating an experience for one who is listening.
So, what is recording about?
Well, the prime responsibility I have as an audiobook narrator is to the author who wrote the story. He wrote it for a reason, whether the reason is to entertain or to stoke people's imaginations or to make people think. I have to decide what I think the author's objective is. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but nevertheless it's my decision. And within that framework, I try to bring an immediacy to the listener. And that's a very important point, because in bringing an immediacy to one who is listening has nothing to do with exposition. Exposition of the story is character. Whoever is talking is a person talking, whether it's the author saying it's a sunny day or it's raining, but something that when you read it to yourself, you absorb that as a fact. When you hear it, the way it's raining is said gives you an implication of how that person talking is feeling. Because what we're doing really is changing the written word into the spoken word. And the space between the two is huge, because it depends on what sieve, what filter these words come through to come out.
So, recording a book is an interpretation.
Absolutely. An actor is an interpreter. Someone writes the words and you say it. Now, sometimes you don't like what you're interpreting, and that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to the author, and not being an arbiter of taste, I then try to make that one person understand what this book is. It reminds me of the Hamlet speech of the players when he says, "The censure of the one must away a whole theater of others." Means that one person who knows whether you are really there or not is who you have to play for. And that person enjoys the book that I may not have really loved, but that person felt it. So that's my job.
Do you feel like the author when you record a book?
That's a very good question. There's a kind of vicarious experience that because I'm telling the story, so in some way I'm the author, I'm the creator, but the author is always behind me. So that's what I do. It's an interpretation that satisfies the author and satisfies me at the same time as an artist.
Why audiobook is a growing format for books today?
That's a good question. We are originally wired to hear things. The need to be told a story is a basic human essential for survival. There is no one who does not hear a story being told. If someone's not talking to him, there's a movie, there's a TV story, there's something else happening. And as far as I'm concerned, people are sitting in their SUVs listening to me talk, while the saber-toothed tiger, which is 18-wheeler, zooms by. People write to me saying they just love traffic jams now because I'm waiting to hear the end of the chapter. People tell me, I get many fan letters. I said, my wife sits in the garage and the frozen food is melting because she wants to hear the end of the chapter. I'm late for work so often because I can't leave the car until I hear what's happening. That touches a very basic core of who we are. If you're not hearing a story, you're not conscious. Even if no one's talking to you, you're telling yourself a story. And the inner monologue that you have, I should have done this, I should have told my boss, why did I listen to her? That's constant monologue. That's a sign that we're alive. And the audiobook goes right to that core. So what happens is that when a person hears a narrator that they like, there's an emotional connection to that person. It's not just a person who's giving them information. It's a person who is in some way connecting so that that listener has a relationship with that narrator because of what the narrator is saying. The book might be good, but it might be bad. They're good narrators. Have people go to libraries and say, I want a book by, and then they say the narrator's name, not the author's name, because they've attached themselves to this person as the teller of stories. It's a fantastic feeling, and sometimes it's daunting. I feel very humbled by it because they've taken me through very dark times in their lives, and hearing those stories have helped them come through it. In fact, I had one man say to me at the end of one program, he said, my wife thinks you have the sexiest voice in the audiobook industry. And I thanked him, and then he looked at me and said, now that I see you, I'm not worried.
Tell me the story about this truck driver.
There was a truck driver. Truck drivers are fascinating because they trade books. There's a library in West Virginia, which is a kind of a junction of highways that cross the country. And they will take a book out of that library, listen to it as they cross the country, and trade with another truck driver in California, say, who will bring that book back and listen to it, and they will trade books. They're great listeners. And this one guy in Montana was driving the freeway, and he was listening to Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And he was just so engrossed that he missed his exit. So he slowed down and backed up into another 18-wheeler, and he had an accident. He was writing me from the hospital, thanking me now for the opportunity that he had to finish listening to the book. And the accident was secondary. It was meaningless because Dostoevsky was first.
Tell me more about your voice. How would you describe your voice?
That's not a good question, because to me, I sound like this. I have always thought of myself as having a high voice. People, they make note of my voice saying, gee, it's so low. It does not sound that way to me. I'm never conscious of how my voice sounds. It's me talking, whoever that is. And however the voice comes out, it comes out in a way that pleases people, that makes me happy. It's you can say if it's a reading experience and changing the written word to the spoken one. An artist, when he paints a picture, has a palette, has a brush, canvas, similar to a narrator. A narrator's brush is his voice. Narrator's palette, as an artist, has many colors on his palette. A narrator has to have an emotional palette of a wide range of feelings, from which he can draw his vocal brush and paint a picture that ultimately is hung in the mind of the listener. It's that kind of process which makes audiobooks an art form. An audiobook well read is that kind of a painting well painted. But the listener comes away with an in-depth knowledge of the value of the experience of the characters in the book. Even Victor Hugo in Les Miserables or Hunchback of Notre Dame. My God, Hunchback of Notre Dame is a wonderful travelogue of Paris. It's a beautifully written book. And to show you the artifice involved, we were searching for a voice for Quasimodo, who has a deformed mouth, jaw, no tooth, and thing, and trying all kinds of things with the voice. And I asked them, people on the other side of the glass, just turn your backs on me. And they turned their backs, and I said, oh, that I ever loved, with my finger in my cheek. And they turned around and they said, how'd you do that? That sounds perfectly. I said, well, that's talent. That's the way it works. So it's artifice, it's arbitrary, but it worked 100% because when you listen to it, that's what it sounds. Now, when I tell people that, it's going to spoil their listening experience because they'll picture me reading with my finger in my mouth with that sound.
What do you need to start recording a book?
Yes, I'm given a book, and of course I have to read the book. If it's a simple book, formula, thriller, bestseller, which doesn't take a lot of intellectual concentration, I skim it through to find out the major characters and place names and people's names and words that I don't know how to pronounce. I circle them and give them to someone who gives me a list of proper pronunciations. And I don't make any decisions except for why I'm telling the story. That's the decision, that's the kickoff point of when I say the sun rose slowly over the man's house, or whatever the first line of the book is. Once I have that, I call it an emotional departure. There's a Western writer called Craig Johnson. I picture him in a certain situation on the front porch, watching the cattle in the field, whatever my imagination supplies me with. And little by little, I kind of hear this man talking as he leans back in his chair and he's looking out and says, well, I want to tell you a little story. And it just grows like that. And if it sounds good to me, whoever is talking in me, then I go with that character of the exposition who tells the story. That's the emotional kickoff. Then comes the people who are coming into that person, whoever is telling that story. There's a reason he's telling the story. These are things that are in my head. Do I want to make you smile? Do I want to make you think? Do I want to make you say, why is that person doing that? These are the points that make exposition so valuable, which many narrators, young narrators, don't really realize. They tend to give information to people. This book is about. The book isn't about. The book is the experience of. That's a big difference thing. And once I have that, sure, there are only about 2 or 3 major characters in a book, and the peripheral characters are characters I can fool around with vocally to paint those portraits, those vocal portraits of it. But the characters that are pretty straight, you can't talk down to an audience. You have to be totally honest. That's how I start.
How do you do when there's a lot of characters speaking on the same page? How do you find a vocal identity for each?
It's a major thing in that the moment a listener says, who's speaking, I lose them. They cannot, for a moment, think, who's talking now? So one of the first things I think about is vocal variety. If someone's talking with a southern accent and somebody talking like that, best speak somewhere else because the next person has to talk like that or some kind of vocal change. And they're arbitrary choices. But the choices are arbitrary only because the difference makes it clear to the listener who's listening. That's a very important point. So that's an arbitrary external decision I make only for clarity.
Do you write some notes about that to help you to hold the distance?
No notes, really. What I do, for example, Marcel Proust, in his Swan's Way, huge sentences, long sentences. I mark it musically with lines going in certain direction. It's like giving myself traffic lights, because if I stop recording, it breaks the flow of whatever creative juices are flowing. So if I mark it in a way that will tell me what comes next, or should I end on a minor key or a major key, because I have to resolve the melody at the end of the sentence, and if whoever is a musician will know what I'm talking about, you have to understand that the beginning of the sentence some way has to relate to the end of the sentence. Between the beginning and the end, maybe 5, 6, 8, 10 lines of parenthetical phrases, qualifications, etc. All that has to be done musically. It's the best way I can explain how to do it. Because if I heard it, if I'm speaking those words, I have to have that same kind of musical rationalization to know, well, this is the note that I'm ending on.
Do you need several tries to make a good recording?
No, I don't. Sometimes in the flow of dialogue, as it happens, as 2, 3 people talking, one line doesn't sound right to me in terms of normal speech. Did that person, the reason why that person is saying something, how that person feels, I try it again. I say, I want to go back there and do it. And the engineer, director just says, yeah, that's much better that way. That's when I make secondary choices. But when dialogue flows, it flows. And when it goes between 2 people, which is the best because you have person A, person B talking. And if it sounds right, I just keep going. For example, I did Don Quixote. I tried to read that 4 or 5 times in my life. I could never get through half the book. But performing it, you become them. And especially Cervantes telling that story has a sharp tongue and such a satirical bent. And I started to enjoy it in a way I never could before. That's what's important to me. If it's valuable to have people not only experience the events, but also come away from it having learned something from the author or from the way I interpreted it, that's gold. That's wonderful stuff.
Do you annotate the books in terms of rhythm, in terms of pace to help you?
No, I don't annotate. The annotation is an internal one. As the scene goes, if there's a chase scene, for example, that has to be read with the idea of chase in mind, not giving information, but the exposition itself, the description of the chase, has to have the feeling of a chase in it. So you're reading fast, you're reading perhaps a little louder, with a sense of urgency, and then when it stops and they said, phew, then you come rest and you have a different pace involved. So the pace is dictated by the nature of the events happening.
Do you read all the books or do you cut the text to reduce the time of the recording?
Word for word. Has to be word for word by the author. Even though you may not appreciate his particular writing style, you can't change that because that's the contract. I'm narrating a book, not rewriting a book. So there are many books that we've done that we commiserate with each other because it's poorly written. But these are books which are out there and there are people reading them. So I try to make them better.
Do you have this feeling of improving them while making your recordings?
Now you're touching my ego now. I would think if a book is poor, if it's a poor book in my taste, which is not everyone else's taste, I feel that if I've done a good job on it, I've made it better because it accentuates the experience of it.
Do you like to meet the author to adjust something for your recording?
Very rarely. One of the best things ever said to me was by an author named Stephen Harrington. He said when he listened to me read it, it was as if he was hearing it for the first time. And that was one of the best things anyone can ever say to an actor, playwright or author, doesn't matter. If you've shown the author that he created a specific life and that you could show him that life, have him experience that life, that's another piece of gold. That answers a lot of your first question. Of all my life, I wanted to have that kind of effect on people, to work on the internal workings of a human being so that it means something to another human being. And if I can end up doing that, I'm a happy guy.
I'm gonna leave the space. Please hold the microphone and add whatever you want to the interview.
It was very interesting talking to Philippe because, again, it kind of specifies why I do what I do. And I'm thankful for this interview. It allowed me to think along lines I've not thought of before. I'm happy to have spoken with Philippe.